Hey guys, time for another video in our What Happens When You Give series. Getting towards the end of this series now. We'll probably wrap up this series towards the end of November, getting ready for the Christmas season. But hey, firstly, I want to say thank you to everybody who has given me feedback, either face-to-face or email or Facebook messages. I had so much encouragement about how this series has inspired and encouraged people to step out in faith and trust God and commence tithing or recommence tithing or up the level of their contribution to the house of God. And so I'm thrilled, not just because that'll enable our church to be able to fulfill more of its calling and mandate. That's a wonderful thing, and that's a big part of why we all give and why we tithe and why we contribute our time and our talent and our treasure to God's house, because we want to see the kingdom advance. But also I'm excited because I know that when I hear and read about people thanking me and honoring God with their tithe and saying, I'm committing to this thing, that God is going to honor you. And that principle of putting God first is an incredibly powerful principle, because God will look after us when we honor him. He says, if you honor me, I will honor you. And so in these next couple of minutes, I just want to draw your attention to this little booklet called God First. And while I've been doing this series, this book came into the church P.O. box, and it's from Pastor Wayne Simpson, who is the senior pastor, along with his wife Mary, at C3 Church in Hong Kong. And he's made some copies of this available to various Australian churches. I've also just purchased a copy of it on my Kindle. It's about $6 or $7, and I really recommend it that you get a copy. Simple little book, reiterates a lot of the points that I've been talking about in this series. I reckon it'd take you probably an hour to read it at the most, and it's not heavy theology. It's just good, practical, faith-building stuff. And really, it's about the powerful truth about the tithe, but the principle is God first. And what Wayne is saying is that tithing is part of this God first principle that the Lord has instituted into creation. Essentially, if we put God first, he promises to look after and provide and protect and all those things, and keep us protected from the plans of the enemy and so forth. And so I just wanted to read to you a few words from the opening chapter of this book, where he opens up this God must be first principle. And this is prior to the tithe mention. He's in the opening chapter here, he's talking about the book of Genesis, right back in the beginning when God created Adam and Eve and put them in the Garden of Eden. And he discusses, this is a long time before the tithe is mentioned. That doesn't actually come into the story until later in Genesis, when Abraham offers a tithe of his income to Melchizedek. But the principle of God must be first can go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And so let me just read this to you, and then I'll just comment on it and we'll close. From the beginning of time, God established an important precedent for humanity that is ratified by God, regulated by the law of Moses, and reiterated by Jesus. That principle is God must be first. This precedent is first revealed to us in the Garden of Eden. The Lord made man and put him in the garden to work and take care of it. God commanded Adam, saying, of every tree of the garden you shall freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. God gives Adam stewardship over the garden. Everything in that garden is for his enjoyment, together with his wife and his future family. Everything except that one tree. Being a faithful steward meant not consuming the fruit of that one tree. I'll read that again. Being a faithful steward meant not consuming the fruit of that one tree. And this is precisely how God's principle of the tithe works. 1 Timothy 6:17 says, God gives us all things to enjoy, but he also tells us to tithe. The first 10% of our increase belongs to him. Leviticus 27:30. This is not to be consumed by us. So we see that from the very beginning of creation, God institutes a practice that demonstrates that mankind are stewards and God is the owner. And this practice flows out of the principle that God must be first. And so God sets up this tree and he says, this is for me. Don't touch this. If you honor me by not touching eating of that tree or not consuming of that tree, if you honor me by doing that, I will give you everything else. Interesting, the devil comes along, and the first thing the devil does is he talks about that tree. He focuses their attention on the one thing that God has said don't touch, and takes their eyes off all the things that God has said they can freely enjoy. And this principle of the tithe is like that. The tithe is one of this one of these God first principles. There are others in the Bible. The principle of the Sabbath is the same. It's a God first principle. 6 days you will work, 1 day you will rest, God says. And if you rest on that day, I will take care of you and I will make up for it. And you see that when he provided the manna on the day off in the Sabbath in the desert. This is the principle of the Sabbath rest of the land. They're saying 6 years you shall farm the land, 1 year you shall let it rest, and I will make up for that, so much so that when you come to the 9th year, you'll still be eating from the 6th year. This principle of put me first, don't consume everything, steward the world on my behalf. You don't own it. God says, I own it. You steward it. This whole principle plays out. God says to the Israelites, come to the house of God, leave your farms, trust that I will protect your crops, I will protect your homes. Come and put me first. Come into the presence of God. 3 times a year it said, come up and present yourself to God and I will take care of that. This is all part of this God first principle. And tithing is one very, very powerful way we can do that as New Testament Christians. It's us saying, Lord, we trust that you've provided everything for us and we aren't going to consume something. We're going to set this aside for you. This 10% belongs to you, and by not touching that, we trust in faith that you will make the 90% go further than that 10%. So tithing is really a faith deal, just like all these other issues I just talked about, because it doesn't make sense that if you don't work, you'll get more, you'll be provided for. God's principle is he is the provider, he is the protector, he is the owner, and when we put him first, he will look after us rather than us needing to look after us. So if you're not tithing, and oftentimes you may be bound by fear, you may be thinking, I can't afford to tithe, I can't afford to do this. Let me rephrase that and encourage you that faith is the opposite of fear. And as a Christian, I would much rather trust God with my destiny than trust myself, because I know myself. I know how easily I can stuff up and make poor decisions. But when I put God first, he promises to even make up for my poor decisions. If I make some wrong choices, God will honor the fact that I have put him first. And so tithing is like that. Let me encourage you, if you're not tithing, it's a great opportunity. Probably one of the most powerful opportunities that we as Christians can have to demonstrate that we are saying no to looking after things ourselves, saying no to trying to solve our own problems, and trusting that God will look after them for us. Well, God bless you. Next, I'm going to talk about the next story in this passage where Cain and Abel offered their offerings. It's the very next story of an offering, and it also follows the same theme of putting God first. Talk to you then.